Okay, so let's talk about another Pokemon theory. But before I get into this, somebody was actually asking me, they asked me, if there's a lot more content that needs to be talked about, why don't some of the videos come out a little bit sooner? And, that's a really good question, but I'll do the best I can to explain it. I'm kind of a little tired right now, but I'll do the best I can to explain it. So when it comes to the Pokemon stuff or just anything, when I make like these theory videos, the golden rule is it has to sort of make sense. There has to be some kind of connection that would otherwise based it to be true. So it kind of wouldn't really be a theory and more like a speculation of some kind that requires a lot of research that makes sense, So like this one, for example, let's kind of get into the video. Charizard was originally, the beta version of Charizard was actually called Dragon4. So it's possible that when Nintendo was when Satoshi Tajiri and them were writing the ideas down, and before they started doing the illustrations, they might have had a bunch of unused concept arts that, what other three dragon types they might have had before it. Because then it really got me thinking, well, why is Charizard not a dragon type as far as the starters go? And and I think I might have figured it out, sort of. Because as far as dragon types go, they would be in a different EXP class. So you think about it, in Pokemon, there's 5 different classes of EXP. Dragons are usually in the 4 and 5, the very slow and the slow tier. They did the same thing with Gyarados in Gen 2? Gen 1? It was originally a dragon type. And then they changed it to a flying and a water type, and then it has quadruple against electricity. So how is it that Lance was still using like a Gyarados, and then you had like a Pokemon like, Charizard was also another good example. Lance would go from, he'd still have they call him the Dragon Master. Because again, if you remember, Claire was the 8th gym leader of Blackthorn City, and they came from and the only ones that could really get into the Dragon Den were people that were like highly experienced trainers. Lance was obviously much stronger than Claire ever was, and we know why. So that was because she was cousins with him, and obviously he was a lot more advanced than she was. So hence, Lance was still young, and not too many people actually even beat both of them. Just because you get to the Elite Four doesn't mean you're going to beat the Elite Four, right? So, because how many trainers got that far? Especially the ones you beat. But what was also really interesting was, Pokemon like Charizard. Lance had a Charizard in Gen 2 when you fought him, and so did Red. So, because he had all 3 starters, obviously, but what was really interesting was how did Lance have a Charizard if it wasn't a Dragon type? And well, the way I look at it, I feel like they kind of made the right decision because they kind of balanced out its typing a little bit more. Even though Charizard's still like a ×4 to, obviously, stuff like that. But it kind of made a little bit more sense because Charizard's more of a flying type and a fire type. Except for like the original Gen 1 games where like Charizard wasn't able to learn fly, at least until the Fire Red remakes in the final version. But it was funny because like in the original version, like if we go back to like some of the prototype data, Charizard actually could learn fly, which was kind of funny. I don't even know, if I remember correctly, I don't even know if Charizard could learn fly in green, but like maybe they changed it. I had to double check. But it's like I've noticed like certain Pokemon, like they scrapped a lot of ideas because maybe originally they didn't know what they wanted to do with it as well. Like another good example, and this will be like, we'll get back into the bird type advantage, the prototype of fly, if you didn't know this. When Pokemon first came out, there was 2 types. There was another type that was scrapped entirely before I guess they decided just to reuse it in a fly because it made more sense. But there were, and I found this out a while ago, so this kind of is another reason to go back to this video, was bird type advantages. There were some Pokemon that were scrapped that were actually called a bird type. It wasn't just a beta for missing though. There were some Pokemon that we found in like some of the assets that were actually leaked from Game Freak servers that were actually like a water and like some of the Pokemon that were scrapped from the original 151 that were supposed to be in the original 191. Because originally it was 190, but like, you know, but because Omega replaced Mew, that's why we consider like the 190 plus Mew. So there was roughly 40 Pokemon that were originally scrapped in the game. And some Pokemon, we still haven't figured out like where some of the other Pokemon might have replaced too if they weren't from the same lineup. Like, for example, there's a Pokemon called Weird Duck that we know of that was an evolution between Psyduck and Golduck. And there was always speculation that maybe their name should have been swapped around, but I guess Weird Duck was like kind of like it was like when Psyduck really started getting, you know, mastering its psychic powers and all that. It was but what's weird is Psyduck is not a flying type. But what Pokemon is it based on? What creature? A duck, a bird. Ducks fly. If you're a hunter, you know this obviously. But it's like you see ducks. You could see ducks in your backyard. You can see them flying in. You know, they fly away. But for some reason though, Psyduck was not a flying duck type. It was a Pokemon. It was just really more of like a duck that just swims rather. So basically this is what I think they did. You know, there was the flying type was supposed to be for Pokemon that could actually fly, like feathers. And then there were some Pokemon there, because, you know, there are some birds like penguins and kiwis, for example, that don't fly at all, but they're still labeled birds though. Why that is, it might just be the kind of genetics that they have, you know. I'm trying to think. There might have been other birds too that they can fly, but they just refuse not to. Like a chicken, for example. Chickens can fly, but they, for the most part, they just don't. They just hang out on. They're more ground based, you know, not because they're heavy, but they just choose not to fly for the most part. Some birds fly more than others. Is basically the point I'm trying to get at. So what I think Nintendo, or what Game Freak really decided at the time, was bird types were supposed to be different than flying types, but then I guess they figured, well, flying types are basically more flying types than bird types should be, so they decided to scrap it, and they chose flying type over it instead of just risking similarities. And then they decided just to call all their Pokemon, like they did have like a normal type or a whatever that would technically mean, because even to this day it kind of gets me a little bit. It's like a normal advantage rather. So, you know, if you're someone who plays if you play a lot of online games, you know, competitively, you know, like, you know, stab bonuses with like normal types and all that, it's just supposed to be like, maybe it's supposed to be like where they you know, they fit every other. If it's not like an elemental type, it's like normal types are basically what you see a lot of. You see a lot of normal type Pokemon. If one of them isn't, if they don't have like a secondary type advantage. It's really interesting actually how they decided that, but it's just where they fit everything else. So I'm trying to think what's another one. But, you know, I kind of feel like they did this. It's kind of like what they did with Charizard, though. Charizard was originally designed as a dragon. It's possible it might have even been like a Dragonite at one point. Good example could be the way you look at its beta concept arts and all that, before they redid everything. I mean, even Dragonite even looked completely different than it did now. It looked more like Dragonair, sort of. Which is actually really interesting, because I had to find that. I had to find that sprite again, but it's a lot of people forget about it. It's possible that maybe they weren't intending that Dragonite have a second evolution. Or maybe I'm just looking at it wrong. Maybe it's Dragonair's beta concept art. But I don't think so. I think maybe there might be more to it than that. But anyways, the way I look at it, I think Charizard, they changed Charizard's typing advantage just due to typing, because they wanted it to be more balanced out. Because the starters, none of the starters are dragon types for the most part. They are like, I mean, that I remember at least. They're all basically supposed to fit into like a certain EXP class, so it'd be all balanced out a little bit. And they also did it. It wouldn't be this. It'd be like the same thing like what they did with Lugia. Why isn't Lugia a pure water type? Well, they did it because they wanted to balance out the typing advantages between the you know, Ho-Oh and Lugia back in the day. So Lugia was basically what was it, like a flying and a psychic type, and Ho-Oh was supposed to be a fire and a flying type. I mean, if you think about it, all legendary Pokemon already have their advantages and their weaknesses. All Pokemon have their advantages and weaknesses. You just got to figure out like what you're up against and who to take them out with. So basically, you'd be surprised what you can do when you find the right setup and all that. But again, Charizard looked a little bit different. The same thing with some of the other Pokemon that were betas. Some of them, like, it kind of reminds me of like how like Blaziken and Latias look the same. Believe it or not, they were actually look like a merged of Pokemon. And it's really interesting because Blaziken might have actually been completely different compared to its final design. Like even its Mega form actually looks more like its original design rather than, and I think that's what they did with it versus like its actual like original concept art. You know, because Torchic looked completely different too, and I'd say even Torchic's beta design looks even more adorable, which is why even to this day I still think we need to really look for like, you know, those beta sprites, because even though we have like the Dexter entries of them, we still need to know what those prototype data looks like if we can just get our hands on an early build of it, wherever that may be, if such a thing exists at this point. But we'll just have to keep looking. I'm sure we can find something. But yeah, it's really interesting what you know, people find on the internet or somebody's servers or, you know, have you, man. It just, think that a series as big as Pokemon, and look at like all the ROM hacks people have made. Look at all the just the lost history basically that, you know, we still have yet to uncover. And, you know, even to this day, I don't even know how many people even talk about this stuff. You know, there's people you can find on YouTube that do, probably they get even more views than I do. But it's just, they don't talk about all this stuff though all the time. And I just find it really fascinating that, you know, there's just so much that we can miss out on. And maybe that's why I keep coming back to these videos, because, you know, I'll be honest, you know, ever since I was digging through the Gen 1 and Gen 2 prototype data, or even just you know, just thinking about stuff, you know, it just made me think, you know, how many more things do we not know that maybe a lot of other people would find interesting? I mean, there's so many things that we don't know about Pokemon, even to this day. You're talking about millions of people that have probably played those games more than they can count in some cases. And it just, you still learn new things about it because there's always that bit of information that you never saw before that you might see firsthand. So that's always cool. You know, always looking forward to the very next thing. So I mean, who knows? So, why did Charizard look a lot different? Why did they change the concept art? Why did they change its typing advantage? Maybe there's more to it than that. But, you know, just like all the other ideas, maybe that's all it was. Maybe they decided it deserves to be a fire and a flying type because it makes more sense rather than it being like a dragon type, because while Charizard does kind of make sense that it is a dragon type, it still does kind of make me think though, you know, if Lance had a Charizard, that there's no doubt that Charizard learned dragon type moves because that's what it originally did. It learned moves like Dragon Claw, Dragon Rage back in the day. I don't even know. Does anybody remember? Does Charizard learn Dragon Rage in Gen 1 or was it Gen 2? No, I actually know it was. It was Gen 2, wasn't it? Am I thinking Gen 2? Because I think so. I'm thinking so. But it can learn Dragon Claw and all that. Like, oh, wait, was it Dragon Claw? Yeah, it does learn Dragon Claw by TM in Gen 3, right? Yeah. I was thinking of Meta Claw too, but that's through leveling up though. But anyways, it's, you know, it is really interesting to think that, you know, it might not necessarily be a dragon type based on hand, but it's like maybe a dragon type in the sense that it understands its momentums, its moves, and it's got that origin behind it, sort of, you know. Maybe that's why a lot of people look at Charizard like it's a strong Pokemon, but it's really interesting just the direction they went in with it. I gotta look, you know, and I gotta double check. Was its Mega Evolution a Dragon type? I don't think so, but I don't know. I there's some things I keep forgetting. I gotta double check, but it does make me think though that, you know, maybe at one point they had these really cool concept designs, and then there's just some things they decided to keep, and then there's some things they didn't. You know, because you know, with a series like Pokemon, being a series that we didn't create, but it's a series somebody else envisioned. You know, even they probably were overwhelmed with how many possibilities they had. I mean, I remember Satoshi Tajiri, just to remind people, you know, even when they started designing the games of Gen 1, they already put like 1,000 hours into it. Like, it's amazing. Like, to think, like, they had so many ideas that but they wanted to do something somehow. And the only thing that was holding them back at the time were cartridge limitations and programming. because none of them had ever done this before, at least not on this level, you know. So, you know, somebody had to figure it out at some point. You know, it's amazing to think how they even pulled it off. You know, I've played Pokemon for years, and I look back and I'm like, wow, man, you know, it doesn't surprise me in the slightest that there's so much more we haven't even learned yet. But what I want to know is the first 300 Pokemon that they originally designed for Gen 1, and then they later pushed it off to Gen 2, and then later on, were those actually all the Pokemon that were originally designed in Gen 2? So, like, for example, like, I've talked to people about this, and again, I mention this every now and again, and I'm still convinced of this. I've talked to some people might say, well, maybe I might be looking at this wrong. But it's like the more you dig into it, it might actually very well be true. It's like there are Pokemon that were originally designed right around the time before Gen 1 was, but they weren't in Gen 1, they were in Gen 2. And if you actually look at some of these prototype Pokemon, they were actually recycled into most of the Gen 2 Pokemon. So then you have Pokemon like Lugia, for example, who weren't originally designed in Gen 1 and Gen 2's prototype all the way up until the final version. And then Lugia was finally added because it was the mascot for Pokemon Silver. But here's where it gets more interesting. If you actually traded the missing no data, why does Lugia come up as one of them? Kind of interesting to think about. Or Suicune, Entei, you know. So how far back or Suicune, Entei, Raikou, you know, how far back does it go? And I mean, if we were to believe that even like Katora, for example, the little electric tiger that was scrapped from Gen 1 and Gen 2 that we never got. But then later on they had like it's called Raitora, like number 2 in the prototype, but it was never in the prototype of Gen 2. But it was in Gen 1 though. So they had this concept art that was later recycled into, and get this, Raikou. Raitora was a sire, because you know, it looked a lot different back in Gen 1, but when they recycled it into Gen 2, they basically, because that was why Katora and Raikou, or Raitora, were like nowhere to be found in the final version of Gen 2. Nobody had ever heard of these Pokemon, but yet they recycled one of them into a legendary Pokemon, which is even more insane, because Raikou was always annoying to catch because it's a Roman legendary. But in the end, it was ultimately like, you know, it was worth it in the end, because they used something for it. So that's interesting. But it's like, you know, a lot of Pokemon designs changed over time, but they still utilize something somehow. So that's interesting to think about. All the different concept arts that we still have yet to go back and double check. And so it's like, it makes me wonder, you know, Pokemon like Lugia were an idea for a long time before it was finalized and copyrighted. You know, even some Pokemon originally were created in 1989 originally, but they weren't copyrighted until like 1995-ish. You know, that's something to think about. That's actually pretty crazy to think about. Even Mew, for example, Satoshi Tajiri's favorite Pokemon, even to this day, I believe. And we found out that Mew was the very first copyrighted Pokemon trademarked. And it wasn't until like 5-6 years later that after it finally was official. Very interesting to think about. So it does make me think, you know, when you're somebody who's designing something, and obviously you're the developer, you're the designer, you're the god of that universe where you're creating your own image and all that. And it just makes me think, like, how long some of these people have these ideas before they're official. You know, we've even seen it with like people like Walt Disney, and for example, like, you know, like with Steamboat Willie, for example, you know, you go back to like 1928 when it officially was done, but like maybe Walt Disney might actually have had those ideas even longer before he actually just went ahead and animated it the way he wanted to, you know, something like Oswald the Lucky Rabbit, which came out in 1927. So for the longest time, a lot of people used to think that Mickey Mouse was the one idea that made Walt Disney who he was, but there were other ideas too, even before that made him who he was before he got to where he was at. It's actually pretty crazy though, you know, how that concept really does stay true, no matter how long ago and how many years go by, past, present, or future. Same thing with all these Pokemon prototype datas. You know, you try to figure out like all these ideas these people had for the longest time, how many ideas they never used, how many ideas they did use, but then they changed them. And then we start to figure out just like in comparison to like when they changed them and when they didn't change them. And I just find it mind blowing just to think about it, you know. So, you know, once again, if you're not subscribed to this channel, please do. I will be making more videos, but I just find it really interesting just how much we really don't know until we really start, you know, really looking into it more. Oh, and something else I want to add, I just found this out. So if you actually look at Charizard's original index number, not what it is in the Pokedex, but the index number that where like Rhydon was the very first Pokemon, and then Victory Bell was like the very last Pokemon, like 190, unless you want to count Mew 191 before it replaced Omega. As far as Dragon4's index number goes, if we're looking at the old Kapu monster designs, Charizard was originally 180 in the original index numbers. However, Dragon4 was 174 at least. So that tells me that because it's really close, it's possible that that was Charizard. And if you look at its original Pokemon Green design back in, let's say, the 1995-ish era, or maybe even 5 years before that, Charizard does look very similar to the two designs. So it's possible that, yes, that is in fact supposed to be Charizard.